Disappeared for a second.
And thanks to everyone who's joining us. We'll get going in just a couple of moments. We always give a little bit of buffer time for some folks to come on. Yeah, so if you want to grab a glass of water, run to the washroom fast, now is a great time to do that. And we'll get going in about 4 minutes.
Somebody,
No, there's no sound.
turn your sound up.
Hi, folks. We're just waiting for a couple of minutes to get started. Thanks, everyone, for those who are joining on. In about 3 minutes, we'll get going. So make sure you have a glass of water. I've gone to the washroom. If you want to grab something to take notes with, that's also fine. And yeah, we'll get going at around 7:05. Thanks so much for joining early. Yeah, thanks to everyone for joining us. I see some folks are already introducing themselves in the chat. That's great. It's a great way to meet each other. I was joking earlier that I get to see one of my neighbors more on Zoom than I do in real life right now. And yeah, we're all kind of coming here together to make change. So it's important to kind of meet friends and neighbors in the community as well. So take a second to introduce yourself in the chat. And we'll get going in just a moment. I'm just going to share again. Just looking for confirmation from Dawn. Are you okay if we get going? Okay, then let's go. And just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Question one, Nancy and Dawn, your faces are on my screen. So could either of you give me a thumbs up or thumbs down? There's not a little black rectangle in front of the screen right now. You can see what you want to see. Perfect.
Everything's fine.
Nice. I get to see some of you then. That's always nice. And some other housekeeping notes are, if you do have any questions, are having trouble hearing, anything like that, folks are muted as they join. We prefer if until we get to the question and answer, folks could stay that way. But we do have the chat. If you've been with us before, you'll have heard this field before. But feel free to kind of type any comments or questions into the chat. We have folks who are regularly looking at it, and we hope there can kind of be a bit of a discussion going on throughout the webinar. And then we'll, of course, talk with all of you at the end of the webinar. And without any, if you want to ask a question under reactions, you can kind of raise your hand. We'll get to questions mostly at the end. And we have folks from the team like Steph who are there to help with some troubleshooting. And so, Steph will post the Hamilton 350 email in the chat, but it's hamilton350@riseup.net. If you are having any issues and for whatever reason the chat's not working, you can email hamilton350@riseup.net and get those questions answered, because we do want everyone to be able to participate and hear what's going on. So without any further ado, let's get this show going. So last week, you'll have heard from, or not last week, last month, we hosted our webinar on the future of conservation. And we focused on what some of the provincial government changes relating to the conservation authorities in the province of Ontario were, and what that really meant, and how they fit into the broader vision that it seems that this government has about conservation. This month, we really dive into one specific change that's been made, and that's the change to really replace citizens on these conservation authority boards with city councillors. So conservation authorities, they line up with the watershed area. So kind of you think of where the water starts from and where it ends up. You can see Hamilton's over here. We go all the way out to almost kind of Cambridge at the headwaters of Spencer Creek in some ways at the west, and then that flows all the way out to Lake Ontario. So while Hamilton is pretty clearly lined up within the municipality of Hamilton, that's not the case. For example, the Grand River watershed doesn't span the political boundaries that we as settlers have drawn, but instead is a much wider area that encompasses 20+ municipalities. And so we focused last month on how the real difficulty in some of these Ford government changes, which removed citizens and made a whole suite of other changes to the core mandate of how conservation authority programs were funded, really weakened conservation authorities, and combined with other things going on at the provincial level, created a dark future for conservation. But we also highlighted that that doesn't have to be the case. We talked about the role citizens are playing, and we're going to kind of dive into that deeper again today in drawing a brighter future for conservation. And so when looking at some of these Ford government changes that we talked about last month, here are some of the news headlines that came when the government's changes were first announced a year ago. And then last month, about a year after the changes were first announced, the regulations, or the piece of the bill that actually has all the details in it as to what these changes will look like, finally came out. And so it's not just the changes to the conservation authorities. This is part of a series of actions from the provincial government that includes ministerial zoning orders, which are basically, I'm going to put this here and no one can stop me when it comes to development, from Minister Steve Clark. It's these super highways that have kind of come back from the dead, like the 413 and the Bradford bypass. And we're going to hear from Nancy how it's also about the forced push on municipalities to sprawl out. All of these things are happening at the provincial level, But one of the things we've noticed at the 350 table is some of the most nefarious changes aren't the ones that, oh, we're going to build this warehouse here, because those people can fight back against. People can kind of easily communicate what's going on. Some of those really nefarious changes are the ones that are procedural or policy, where they tweak how things go. So the next time someone has an application, citizens aren't told about it, or suddenly you don't have to have an environmental assessment. And that's some of what we're seeing, or what we anticipate we might see with this change to really limit the role of citizens on the Conservation Authority Board. So just this is a recap of our last webinar. So I'm going to go through it a bit quickly. But in 2019, the kind of province started hinting at conservation authorities. They then passed legislation in 2020. Despite the huge opposition, they really had the advantage of having a year to kind of work on those regulations behind closed doors, put them up on the public, put them out. And some of that initial blowback had really died down because a whole year had passed. And so now here's really what we saw. We saw that the new regulations imposed rules on what the core mandate of a conservation authority is, and that really impacts how they can fund their programs. So yes, we agree what's in the core mandate is important, but there's a lot of things that were left out. Conservation authorities do more than just flooding and erosion control and managing existing lands, and it put everything else in financial jeopardy. So some of these things that are left out of the picture, and from 350, the big one is, of course, climate change, but they also relate to things that we may use. So for example, if you want to hike or have a new trail put in, there were difficulties to getting that funded. Now there needs municipal agreements to fund all of these programs. So this is the context with which we find ourselves in. It's not the conservation authorities of 2016 or 2017. There's a new kind of shift going on in conservation authorities that we started exploring last month under this Ford government. And we're really going to dive into more in depth today. But before we do, we know that the province isn't the only one making these changes. People power has been integral in pushing back against some of these campaigns. So from in Pickering, Ajax, the campaign to save their wetland and stop the Amazon warehouse that's now been moved to Blair in Cambridge area, and Blair's community is now still fighting against this Amazon warehouse. The No to Jinshi glass plant in Stratford, that was an MZO that was successfully rebuked, much like the Amazon warehouse in Pickering. And Nancy's going to tell us about the recently successful campaign to save farmland and stop sprawl in Hamilton. And of course, the campaign to stop the 413 is still ongoing, and it's not over yet. And so this is really what I want to talk about is we've been successful as people across Ontario winning some of these battles when there's a clear, this is what we're going to lose. But the procedural changes, the Ford government's had a lot more success at making. And so with that, I'll throw it over to Nancy to talk to us a little bit about, given that we know we're going to be standing up for conservation, what did we learn from the Stop Sprawl campaign?
Thanks, Alex. Thanks very much. Okay, if I can share my screen, then I will get going. Well, I had it all set up. Okay, here we go. Just give me a sec. Alrighty. Okay, thanks everybody for coming out tonight. So good evening, and I really appreciate being asked to speak tonight. So despite everything that Alex has just said and the environmental degradations and the abuses that seem to be running rampant with our current provincial government, I am happy to be here to share at least one local success story with you. And it's all about public engagement, and lots of it. It's about a grassroots movement that people power turned into what Joey Coleman described in this tweet as a seismic shift in Hamilton. So last December, we learned that the city was planning a boundary expansion, and there were two choices put out to the public. One was Sprawl and the other was Sprawl Max. And neither of those seemed like a very good plan. which Linda Lukasik was the one that opened my eyes to. So the next day I wrote to the city planning department and asked, where is the no expansion option? And the reply was that there isn't one, because the Doug Ford Progressive Conservative government has changed the rules, and the city planners all across the Greater Golden Horseshoe now have to use the new market-based methodology to land use planning. So in short, the big sprawl was now upon us. So I called my friend Michelle Tom to complain, and together we decided to do something about it. And that's really what began the movement that set us on our course to success. We started reaching out to people, and within about 10 minutes, we reached Zoe, who's here tonight. A little bit later came Lily, and then a few others joined in. And over time, we grew to be a pretty big group. We reached them by phone, by email, through social media. We started getting people together to tell them what was about to go down. And of course, Dr. Don McLean and Dr. Linda Lukasik, who are old pros at this and who have been fighting this kind of craziness in Hamilton for ages, teamed up with us. And we're very, very lucky to have teamed up with Hamilton 350 and Environment Hamilton. So a couple of months before the council voted, a coalition of developers who owned the potential expansion land hired Canada's largest PR company, Strategy Corp, to help them take us down by creating a fake grassroots group called Hamilton Needs Housing. Suddenly their ads were everywhere, asking people to sign their petition for affordable housing, which actually ended up being a vote for urban expansion. They tried to trick people, but as you can see from the surveys that people were returning back by the hundreds, people were onto them. So instead of filling out their petition, they sent them a message back. The developers had a lot of money riding on this expansion, and a lot of people were fooled, but some were not. And in the end, we're glad to say that their campaign failed. But I do want to share with you some of the practices that we used, which really did help with our campaign. Firstly, we created a website, a brand, a logo, and a name for our campaign. We built up our base, and we invited people to attend weekly planning meetings and to contribute whatever way their talents allowed. So we use an excellent mapper with GIS specialties. Some folks were like the person who designed this newspaper ad here, are graphic artists. Our website, our newspaper ads, and our social media accounts were all created by willing volunteers with experience in all their different areas of expertise. We created social media accounts and started blasting our message out in any way we could. For Facebook and Instagram, if a particular post got a lot of views or shares or likes, we'd boost it further by paying a little bit of ad money to make it into an advert that would reach even further. It turns out Facebook advertising is actually really good value for money, and so we boosted a lot of posts. We had a dedicated email that was checked multiple times per day, and that was also connected to our website. And through that email, two big benefactors stepped up and reached out to us, offering to lend their financial support to help us win this battle. We also partnered with Wellington Water Watchers, and they helped facilitate an online rally, which I think we had about 150 to 200 people attended, to save the farmland. And at that rally, we raised a couple, 10,000 or about $30,000. We used that money to fund all of our advertising and our lawn signs, and to set ourselves up with an email tool, which with one click sends one person's email in support of no expansion to the mayor, to all the councillors, and even to the city staff. We designed our lawn signs and distributed about 1,600 of them via volunteers throughout the city. This map shows some of those. We kind of lost track after 1,600 or so. Probably after about 200 we lost track. But this is a neat map because it shows a lot of equal distribution for support, all through the city. And near the end of our campaign, we ran radio ads that were professionally created, and we had full page ads in the Spectator a couple of times as well. Another useful tool in getting our message out was encouraging people to write letters to the editor and opinion pieces in The Spectator. And we worked very closely with Environmental Defense and their lawyer, Phil Pothen, and set up meetings with him and our councillors. The vote itself ended up surpassing our expectations, and the result was 13-3 against expansion. It was better than we had hoped for, and we are elated. And now we're on to next steps to make this firm boundary stick and make it a success. So the next goal is to end exclusionary zoning in Hamilton. This is zoning covering the vast majority of our city, and it only allows for single-family homes to be built in these yellowish areas here. It's crazy to think that building a duplex is actually illegal and very difficult to do in Hamilton. Changing zoning laws to allow for more missing middle housing within existing neighborhoods, such as semi-detached houses, duplexes, towns, and stacked towns, is what we must do going forward if we are to make this fixed urban boundary a success in the future. The current trend is to tear down an older bungalow in a lot of the neighborhoods in Hamilton and replace it with a McMansion. But what if we could, instead of building McMansion on that spot, what if we could build a semi-detached house on that spot? Well, then we've just doubled our density and reduced the footprint of that house and the price tag of that house. And this is the sort of thing that would make for affordable housing. So this decision of no boundary expansion is a win-win-win. We've saved 3,300 acres of Hamilton Mountain farmland, wetland, and habitat. We've halted more infrastructure being installed that will only go towards worsening our already near $4 billion infrastructure deficit. And we've been given the opportunity to build a climate resilient city with neighborhoods that have decent transit, local jobs, affordable housing, shops, and amenities all nearby. So this is what's possible with people power, because when we work together, we can win together. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much for that, Nancy. And you know, we're going to come back to the fight to save Sprawl, but I think all of us, many of you on the call are probably involved in the Sprawl campaign in some way, shape, or form. And just like a real moment to like pat ourselves as citizens on the back for the work. And Nancy and some of the leadership of Stop Sprawl, thanks so much for helping us and empowering Hamiltonians across the city to raise their voices, to participate democratically. And Dawn's going to let us know about another recent campaign where Hamiltonians got a chance to raise their voices and how it led to a better outcome.
Thanks very much, Alex. And probably many of you on the call. Am I getting an echo or am I okay? Yep. Many of you on the call are have been following this and know some of the earlier history of the offsetting issue in the Hamilton Conservation Authority. A year ago, there was a proposal by developers to relocate, basically to destroy a wetland and create another one that wasn't in such an inconvenient position for the land that they owned. That led the Conservation Authority Board, a majority, to direct their staff to create a policy that would allow such things to happen. And that policy came out in a draft form in the spring and then went out for public consultation in the summer. In the meantime, the developers showed up and tried to push through their proposal without the policy. And that was the Ancaster wetland relocation that many of you remember. And it was defeated. It was defeated by a mass public engagement, over 200 letters, 8 delegations. We did a couple of webinars on it, followed it very closely. And at the end of the day, after the hearing, they went in camera to make a decision, came back out and said, we're turning down the permit. And that was unprecedented. We haven't seen a development permit at the Conservation Authority being completely turned down before. But the offsetting policy was still out there. So it went out for a public consultation through the summer, and it got, again, huge amounts of response. Over almost 300 people sent in responses to it, including several organizations. A couple of them, like the Home Builders Association, were in favor of an offsetting policy that would allow for relocation and tearing out of wetlands and other natural features and making other ones somewhere else. But the vast majority were opposed. And this level of engagement, this policy document that people were commenting on was 6,000 words. This isn't a minor piece of, what do you think of this survey kind of question. This is a major engagement by people concerned about what's happening to the natural features of our community. So at the end of the day, we ended up with a recommendation from staff not to have an offsetting policy, with the exception of when the provincial government forces the Conservation Authority to do something, such as through a ministerial zoning order. The board of the Conservation Authority debated this, discussed it at their last meeting earlier in November, and they came to the conclusion that they would not support, they would support the offsetting, the staff recommendation and oppose an offsetting policy. So we've got a bit of video here. I think we're going to start this now. And what you're going to see is commentary from a couple of the board members, Brad Clark, one of the councillors on the board, and Cynthia Jansen, one of the citizens on the board. And then we'll end off with the counter views of the chair of the board, Lloyd Ferguson. So we thought it useful for you to get to see some of this discussion. It went on longer than this, and everyone except one councillor actually spoke to this. And Mr. Ferguson was the only one who said, no, I don't like this. I don't want this recommendation. I want a full offsetting policy. Councillor Jackson said he was reluctantly supporting the staff position, but everybody else was enthusiastic for it. So let's run a bit of that video so we get to see some of it.
Staff for
starting with Clark.
Leading us through the consultation. I thought the consultation, in terms of past consultations that Hamilton Conservation Authority has had, this consultation was very comprehensive. And to get 274 roughly responses back, and then 20 some odd emailed responses on a survey that literally asks, I think it was 6 questions. I thought we did very well. So congratulations, Scott and Lisa, in terms of that consultation. I think the recommendation that is before us is a reasonable compromise. Instead of opening up the entire watershed to natural feature offsetting, what our staff is recommending is that we prepare for instances where there's ministerial zoning order, provincial municipally led environmental assessment projects. I think that is a reasonable approach that most people in the city of Hamilton would understand. Where it gets to allowing offsetting right across the watershed, that's where residents have keenly raised concerns. And so I'm fully supportive of what the staff recommendation is. Like I said, I really appreciate the work that went into the consultation, but also the work that went into drafting this response to us. And most certainly I call it a white paper, but the discussion paper, Scott, that was drafted was very comprehensive and well read by people. So I want to thank staff for their thoroughness. And I fully support the recommendation. Thank you, sir.
By leading by example as the authority, that's a good thing because we're sticking to our guns. We're saying those natural features should be maintained in place.
Thank you, Chairman Lloyd. I would just like to again add my voice to those who are commending the staff for really a lot of work. Very, very, very technical, very involved. I would also like to thank all the community members who made the time to read through the discussion paper and give us their thoughtful responses. I was impressed at how much response we had. It shows that this issue strikes at the heart, I would venture to say, of what makes us a conservation authority and what people expect from us. I was very interested to see that we had a letter from our former general manager, Ben Vanderbroek, on this. And he made some excellent points, as did many other people. But Ben used the term treasure a few times in his letter, and that kind of resonated with me. I see that people are looking to us to guard that treasure. I support this recommendation. I believe it is both principled and pragmatic. And again, I commend staff for the hard work on a somewhat controversial and certainly highly technical issue. I think everyone has done a terrific job on this. And again, I would thank everybody, including the members of the public who got involved.
Quite frankly, I was disappointed with the report. On November the 5th, as said right at the start of the report, it says that staff were directed to draft a policy on offsetting. And later, it came back quite promptly. I was surprised how fast it came back. I got a little bit of glue at an earlier meeting for congratulating Scott on that, but I was surprised how fast he brought it back, and we directed staff then to put it out for public consultation. 3 other conservation authorities have in fact adopted offsetting policy. They include the Credit River, the Lake Simcoe Conservation Authority, and the Toronto Conservation Authority. And I tell you what I like about the offsetting policy. And I'm going to reference a lot to 140 Garner Road because, as Scott said earlier tonight, we've only had one. And that was quite a hearing we went through a few months ago. And but it's in the Airport Employment Growth District. This is a large tract of land that the city of Hamilton brought in as employment land, future employment land, and it's coming on stream now. That parcel of land runs from Upper James to just east of the new Highway 6, the Highway 6 South is called, from Garner Road down to the airport. And it does have quite a few ESA areas, of which the property at 140 Garner Road was one with a wetland. But what I like about the offsetting policy is I like the jobs. There were 6,000 jobs. Number 2, I like the tax revenue. And the city's been saying for as long as I've been on council, which is 15 years now, we need to focus on more industrial, commercial, or employment land and commercial development to reduce the tax impact to our taxpayers. I like the fact under the offsetting policy, and Mr. Robichaud touched on this in his comments, and I've heard Scott comment on it, that we would make it as a condition increase in the size of the wetland at the developer's expense. I like the fact from what I saw when I went out to 140 Garner Road is that that particular wetland is infested with invasive species. This would get that cleaned up and have more natural species planted in there. It was badly rutted to the point I fell into a rut, and you can't see them because it's so overgrown from farm tractors trying to get through it and cutting in or getting stuck. And so this would give us an opportunity to not only clean up the invasive species and plant the right species that we like to see in our wetlands, but an opportunity to fix that grading issue, then protect it later after the development of the industrial lands or the employment lands take place. We're going through a very painful debate right now at the city on expansion of the urban area boundary. And wetlands, as we saw at 140 Garner Road, don't run nice and neatly down property lines. They go across, in the case of 140 Garner Road, on an angle and make it a lot of the property undevelopable because you can't put a building up that's a warehouse and with all kinds of different shapes to it. They generally have to be squared to allow overhead cranes to run inside, delivery trucks to access and egress. And by following the wetland contours, it'll make a lot of that land undevelopable, which means in the future we'll need more urban boundary expansion because we won't get the yield that we'd like to have got out of those lands in the Airport Employment Growth District. I'm a little concerned about the MZOs that we're suggesting as the solution, because I think it's a red herring. Scott said, and I've heard the same from the Premier when I was at an event, and there was some development there. He was getting questioned on it. He says, remember 3 letters, MZO. But he said, as Scott said tonight, don't put it in unless the municipality agrees. Well, traditionally, my experience of 15 years on council, when it comes to conservation areas, that city staff will reach out to the Conservation Authority for their comments. So we get a request for support to MZO. Staff are going to set it back out to the conservation authorities for their comments, and we're going to be right back in this mess again. Nothing's going to be gained. And so that troubles me, how we're going to manage that. You know, if the city's council decides it's the right thing to do to support an MZO, how can we do that if the conservation authority is going to continue to object? And, you know, we heard the footsteps coming up behind us on all these radical changes that the government brought in for conservationers. They were sending us a pretty strong message. Your decisions could be appealable now to Ontario Land Tribunal. We can issue zoning orders. And so I think they were sending a message hoping that we would come around and come more in line with their thinking, right, wrong, or indifferent. I know a lot of you don't agree with that, and I understand why.
So that was an excerpt from the meeting that took place at the beginning of November of the Conservation Authority. Chair Ferguson, City Councillor Ferguson, at the end of his comments, did agree to support the resolution, so it was passed unanimously, but he said he was supporting it because everybody else, it was going to pass anyway, so he would support it. The only other person on the board who expressed any concerns about this was Councillor Tom Jackson, and he indicated that he would reluctantly support this. The third councillor on the board is Esther Pauls. She's the only person on the board who didn't make any comments about it, so we don't know exactly what her position was, although she voted for it as well. And you heard from Brad Clark, and then from one of the citizen members, Cynthia Jansen. The other citizen members also spoke and all were in favor of it. So Hamilton 350 is concerned about what we saw here in terms of the chair of the Conservation Authority taking the position that he took, that taxes and jobs are what really is important and conservation should be pushed aside on that, or at least wetlands should be pushed out of the way or relocated or taken apart or whatever. We have asked the Ontario Ombudsman to review this situation to see if there's some way that we can file a formal complaint. And we're suggesting that you may want to write to your city councillors and make your comments known to them about what you just saw here tonight, what has happened with respect to this. All of the members of the Conservation Authority Board, except one, are chosen by the City Council, 5 councillors and 5 citizen members. The 11th member is chosen by Puss Lynch. So the Hamilton City Council has control basically over the composition of these boards, and they maybe you may be wanting to ask them to ensure that they are putting people on this Conservation Authority board who are conservationists. That choice will come up again a year from now when the new council comes into office. Between now and then, in February, there is a vote for who will chair the Conservation Authority for the next year. That occurs every year. That's coming up at the February meeting, and we'll keep our eye on that, what happens with that. And we'll provide you with addresses for the follow-up, to do the follow-up to your city councillors.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dawn. And this really brings out the title of our webinar this week, Money versus Nature. And we're going to kind of follow into that theme a little bit more. But as we said, if more, as the 4 government changes come into effect over the next little while, if more and more city councillors are on these boards and we have fewer and fewer citizen representatives, it really is an issue, because as we heard from Lloyd himself, he was at a development event we can read that as probably fundraiser with the premier, where was kind of lauding the fact that, oh, we can overturn anything. We have an MZO. And Councillor Ferguson, who's also the chair of the Conservation Authority Board, was bemoaning that staff didn't do a good enough job kind of rolling over for the province, getting out of the province's way. And so that's a really big change. We've been tracking kind of both local and provincial issues, and we saw this connection here. And it's the same connection we always have, where there seems to be some people who stand to make a lot of money off of these decisions, who have some friends in places of power. And so we are really encouraging folks, and we'll have a little bit of a follow-up, to get in touch with Hamilton City Council about who they're sending and how they're appointing people to the Conservation Authority. But it goes a little bit deeper than that, because we are also in a climate emergency, something that should come as no surprise to the folks on this call. And that means that we need to be doing things differently. It's not just enough for our conservation authorities to not move wetlands, although it is congrats to us as citizens for putting that in and for getting that win. But shouldn't we be taking actual action, progressive action on the climate crisis, not just merely standing up to action in the wrong direction? And so we know that at the provincial level, it's full of climate deniers. Seth Klein, who's the former BC director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and an author of A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, has kind of coined this new climate denialism, which is where our leaders say they understand the climate crisis, but they don't act like it. Basically, they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. They're not doing the things that science says we have to do. And when pushed, reluctantly, you can get Ford ministers to acknowledge the climate crisis, although one of their environment ministers really struggled with that a few years ago, but they're not walking the walk. And this is what the Auditor General, the independent officer of the province, has said that the ministry's projected emission forecast and estimated emission reductions for all of the areas of the plan are not supported by sound evidence or sufficient detail. The plan is not likely to achieve its proposed emission reduction target. And I will add that that is not, maybe a higher emission reduction target that we're falling short of. The province of Ontario implemented Harper's plan for carbon emission reductions. So we are failing at an already too low target. So in the face of a climate crisis and in the face of a provincial government that's only dragging us in the wrong direction, shouldn't conservation authorities be where resistance is happening? Opposed to what Councillor Ferguson said, rather than getting out of the way of the province, shouldn't conservation authorities and their citizen boards and all of us be doing everything we can to get in the way? And Conservation Ontario, which is the group that represents all 36 conservation authorities across the province, has said similarly, they want to play a role in climate action. Their most recent, they sent out a quarterly kind of news release. Their most recent news release was all about the role conservation authorities can play in climate action through land management, weathering, flooding, all of this. And we're going to biodiversity and habitat loss protection, but we're going to hear from some of our citizen conservation watchers now on what is happening at conservation authorities. We're going to hear some of the success stories, but we've already heard that in Hamilton, at least, we need a little bit more push and we need a little bit more momentum. And so from our Conservation Watch program, repeat viewers will know that we as citizens with the Hamilton 350 Committee watch 5 Conservation Authority meetings throughout kind of the Hamilton and extended area. Grassroots members of groups like Hamilton 350, Action 13, and Stop Sprawl Hamont attend these meetings. They're generally public, and if they haven't been, we've worked hard to get them public. And so we can hear about these things and show you the clips like we just did of Councillor Ferguson. And so up next, we have Carol Ann with a report about the importance of the flooding work that conservation authorities can and do sometimes from the Grand River Conservation Authority. Carol Ann?
Hi, folks. Good evening. I'm part of the CA Watch, and I'm reporting on the Grand River Conservation Authority flood warning system in light of the current flood emergencies that have been happening in British Columbia. At their latest meeting, which was Friday morning, they were talking about the emergency in BC and wondered whether we in Ontario are in good shape to respond with our systems to flooding. So here we have a picture from the Grand River Conservation Authority of Westover, which is in Waterloo County. And this was taken June the 23rd, 2017. And it was the first major flood in that area since 1954. So in discussing whether we're ready or not, the Grand River Conservation Authority, the discussion was such that in Ontario, we're not like BC. We have small events, but they're annual. And because they're annual, we must maintain a steady readiness, though, all of the time. And therefore, because of that steady readiness required, warning systems are an important element. So for this conservation authority, a lot of work has been done over the years to prevent flooding. And of course, that state of emergency in BC exemplifies the need for conservation areas. So what they'll do, in fact, is forecast flood warnings of now, my picture's sitting over my text, so I can't read it. Oh, let's see here. Sorry. No, there. So they'll forecast floods and issue flood warnings to flood coordinators, who will then implement their own local response plan and assist local residents. And they follow all across Ontario a flood status indicator, which you can find or should find on any conservation area in Ontario's website. And using a color-coded system, it shows the current flood status. So green, it's okay, there's no flooding. Yellow, it's an overall watershed condition statement. There are usually a few statements attached to that, but one should start reading and be informed at that point. Orange, well, that's a watch, a flood watch, and the red color is then a warning, and that may in fact include road closures and evacuations. Conservation authorities rely on working in collaboration with their communities, that's for certain. They bring their expertise and all of their resources. And as we've seen today on the municipal level, they really do deserve responsible municipal partners. And that's it, folks.
Thank you so much for that, Carol Ann, and for really highlighting, when folks are willing to do the work, there's certainly work to be done. Another example of what Conservation Watch members want to talk about, we have David coming from the Credit Valley Conservation Authority. David, you want to unmute and join us?
Thank you. Wow, what a not very good start. Let's try and improve on that. Thank you. I wrote a very short article, just very brief indeed, called The Value of Conservation Authorities. This was a product of my attendance on November 12th last to monitor the board meeting of the Credit Valley Conservation Authority with Sue Carson. Everybody hear me okay? As part of Hamilton 350's program of monitoring conservation board meetings. At the moment, by my count, we have 8 members monitoring 5 different boards. This may alter depending on the availability of members. This program has the aim of producing information that we otherwise would not be aware of. Given the forward government's hostility to conservation, which is reflected in its attitude to the conservation authorities, to wit, reducing their authority over the environment, with the aim of smoothing the way for their developer friends to build on agricultural and conservation land, regardless of the damage such projects will have on the environment, such as 413, keeping a weather eye on the conservation authorities is only prudent. During the CVC board meeting, there were 2 presentations. The first, entitled Bridging the Gap, How Public and Private Owners and work together to improve stormwater management attracted my attention. I don't want to go through all the technical details of the presentation, which I'm not qualified to comment on anyway. My focus instead is on the central idea behind the presentation, to wit, that cooperation between private and public landowners to build, quote, low impact development, end quote, projects can significantly improve stormwater management at a cost much reduced from the present level. Considering we are about to embark upon, whether we want to or not, a lot more stormwater mitigation project, I should say, this seemed very reasonable. The presentation brochure, which CVC were kind enough to send to me, and I can send out to other people if they want it, free of charge, noted that the project is a multi-agency initiative. It's telling that the agencies that cooperated to produce the project did not include the provincial government. So from the point of view of the province, wrecking the best agricultural land in the province to save a few minutes commute on a freeway, you bet. Funding a low cost and apparently sensible project for floodwater flooding, not so much. It also points out the value of conservation authorities who, with very limited funds, are apparently doing a lot of heavy lifting and new ideas about stormwater management, which is evolving from a dull sounding, low priority subject to something of vital importance to our survival. Reason enough for the province to stop trying to strangle conservation authorities and instead fund them consonant with their real importance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David and Carol Ann, because, you know, we've talked a lot about the changes we need to see at conservation authorities before, and we're going to get into that a little bit more right now, because it's not just conservation authorities that manage land in Ontario and protect biodiversity. In fact, we know that Indigenous communities are responsible for huge amounts of protection of land, biodiversity, and even stopping carbon emissions. And I think this is something that we really want to highlight. Earlier, we talked about how when we fight, we win, and the importance of people power. How despite the fact that in Hamilton, at least, our city council and our conservation authority board were not maybe our best friends when it came to some of the initiatives we wanted to see, we're much more eager to side with the developers. People pressure worked. And this is something that has been working and continues to work. So for example, a new report from Indigenous Environmental Network and the Oil Change International found that Indigenous resistance has stopped or delayed greenhouse gas projects equivalent to at least 1/4 of annual US and Canada emissions. That's incredible. That's 26 resistance struggles, things like what's going out and what's the wetland right now, things like land back lane, like these frontline struggles really do make such a huge difference. In fact, this report showed that that was the equivalent of 400 new coal plants or 345 million vehicles on the road. And at the global stage, we also know that Indigenous lands harbor more biodiversity than traditionally protected areas. Studies conducted in Brazil, Australia, and Canada have shown that Indigenous land management has better outcomes for biodiversity. With at least 36% of the world's remaining forest landscapes and continuous tracts of forests and other important habitats found in Indigenous territories, Indigenous control of land is so important in reducing deforestation. And these formal protections offered through conservation authorities, you know, are susceptible to provincial meddling. So as much as it's our job, I'm assuming as many settlers on the call, to engage with conservation authorities and really jump in and make sure that it's not going from worse and suggesting ideas for the better. It's just also important, and I think, to ground this in, we're not the only ones struggling. And in fact, there's a much larger struggle ongoing as well that needs our support. And so we're gonna hear a little bit more about that. But first, I believe we have former Conservation Authority Chair and City Councillor Brian Mccaddy on the line with us. And Dawn, I believe you have some questions for Brian.
I have questions. Do we have Brian? If you're here, Brian, can you unmute?
So let's give it a go again in maybe 5 minutes. I know he's coming from another meeting, so we appreciate him taking some time with us tonight. Jim, why don't you take it away and kind of talk to us about what we can be doing and what we need to be aware of when we think about how we can be supporting not only better conservation authorities, but Indigenous land management and Indigenous sovereignty.
Thanks, Alex. I'm not going to go into the details that I normally go into about these two Wampum Belt agreements that we have with First Nations peoples. I've talked about this before. I'd like to briefly reflect upon them, though. And really what I'm going to be talking about is kind of a couple of analogies that relate to this theme of this webinar, which is nature versus money. Now, in your screen, you'll see the upper right. This is a Wampum Belt agreement. It's called Dish with One Spoon. Many of you have heard of it before. The dish represents the environment. The single spoon represents the fact that we need to share the resources of the environment and take only what we need. There are no knives at the table, reflecting the fact that we have a peaceful agreement to share the land and the environment. We all know that we haven't kept the environment very clean as settlers in general. The other Wampum Belt, the two-row wampum, is an agreement. The first, sorry, I should say that the first was an agreement among the Haudenosaunee that was then shared with the Anishinaabe people and then with settlers as well. So we are part of this agreement, and this is an agreement that focuses on land and taking care of it. The second one is the two-row Wampum Belt Agreement. And this agreement reflects the river of life along which both the First Nations people travel in their canoe and the settlers generally travel in their sailing ship. And the idea of this two-row wampum is that we travel through life with respect for each other and without interfering with the steering of each other's vessels. Now, I've harped upon this in the past, and it should be clear to everyone that those of us in the settler big ships have interfered with the steering of the canoe in very major ways, and you all know examples of this. So let's look now at the second slide here. This is an image that represents the settler view of treaties. This is the Between the Lakes Treaty. So this purple area that you see shows an area of about 3 million acres. And the Mississaugas were paid, this is the way Europeans go about these treaties, they were paid goods worth about 1,180 pounds to the Mississaugas back in 1792. Current value of that, of those goods is about $4,500,000, $450,000, sorry. And so that's what they were paid for this land. And the way the European style treaties go is you buy the land and then you own it and you partition it off. Now the land value today, if we make some very conservative assumptions, where it's worth, let's say, $7,100 per acre, if we multiply that times 3 million acres, which is the area of the Between the Lakes Treaty, that comes out to this enormous $21 billion plus. So the Mississaugas received less than 0.0022% of the value of their land. In other words, the land was essentially stolen. Now, if we look a little bit further along, here we see the crux of the matter. On the left, we see the Wet'suwet'en River. This is part of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. This is the headwaters, the sacred headwaters of a river that serves very important purposes to the Wet'suwet'en people. And on the right side, we see the Coastal Gas Links pipeline. This is all about money. It's about taking fracked gas from somewhere near Dawson Creek and piping it to Kitimat, where it would be changed into liquid natural gas and shipped offshore. So we've got nature versus money. Money meaning extraction, pollution, and release of CO2 emissions, leading to further climate change. So this is kind of another analogy about what we're talking about today, nature versus money. The Wet'suwet'en is, as I said, the sacred waters, the sacred headwaters that are feeding the Wet'suwet'en territory with clean drinking water. You can drink right out of this water. Now, on the right, you can see what Coastal GasLink's pipeline, the TransCanada company, has done to this land. There is a scar across this land, across this habitat, that is without the consent of the hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en people. And these are the people that have authority over these lands. These lands were used for hunting and trapping and other aspects of natural life of the Wet'suwet'en people. This is the response that we give them, trying to protect their environment from damage from the production of this pipeline. On November the 20th, 2021, this is the Coyote Camp near the Wet'suwet'en River, where the CGL pipeline was to be put under the river. So they were going to drill and put fracked natural gas under this river, putting the river and their drinking water at risk. And what happens, and this was happening during the time of flooding in BC, when there was an all-out call for people to help with those impaired by flooding and landslides and so on. The RCMP went in full force against the Wet'suwet'en people, and the next slide you can see how they basically, this is the tiny home of the daughter of one of the hereditary chiefs. Slado was in this home with some other people, including 2 reporters, when the RCMP used an axe to break down the door and then a chainsaw to open it up. You see here an RCMP officer pointing an automatic weapon at these people. These people have protested without weapons at all. They've been nonviolent, and here comes the RCMP to take over. In the next slide, you can see that this has been going on for a while. This is 2019, the January raid of the Gittingham camp that was on, again, this is all on unceded Wet'suwet'en territory. The Wet'suwet'en have not signed any treaties. They've not given the rights for the BC government or the RCMP to come in, or for the CGL to move across their territory. The hereditary chiefs have all denied access to their lands, and yet here comes our troops with automatic weapons to overwhelm these people. So this line that you see is a line from Lee Reed, a local artist, and I think it speaks to an important issue. Do you know where you stand? On where you stand? We stand on stolen land. You can see the patterns here between nature and food land in Hamilton that should be protected from developers and their friends. But we have a city council and to some extent people on the board of the Conservation Authority that are supporting development. And it's you and me and the Hamilton Conservation Authority that should be standing in their way and protecting our lands from development. And I must add, though, that what the Wet'suwet'en people are going through is a lot more dire than what we're going through. Nonetheless, I think it's a good analogy for what we are facing, and I hope it will inspire people to get out there and speak their minds and try to protect nature and our food lands.
And
thanks very much for listening, folks.
Thanks, Jim. And if folks, because this is happening right now, like this is the country we live in is sending the military, the police force to arrest people standing up for their land, to steal land, like Jim. I know we're going to send out some information in the kind of document we send out at the end of our webinars, but for folks right now, what's a resource, or where should people go if they want to learn more or get engaged in this struggle happening on the West Coast?
If you go online, there are plenty of sites that give, if you Google Wet'suwet'en and RCMP, you'll see this, and you will also see, if you want to look into police, we have something going on in Hamilton where we have people that are trying to protect houseless people. These are folks that are involved in the Hamilton Encampment Support Network, and they are being treated very badly by our police force in a brutal and racist fashion. So there's a lot of information about racism and how our police and our RCMP are acting against people that are trying to stand up for others that are doing very good things, especially in this case, the Wet'suwet'en people trying to protect their land.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jim. And I kind of just want to emphasize some of what you talked about and kind of close out what we've been talking about throughout this webinar, which is, despite the outsized role that Indigenous peoples play in protecting nature, these contributions so often go overlooked. In fact, when we think about the modern conservation movement and some of these conservation authorities that we're so lucky to walk through, many of them, although all of their origins are unique, many of them started as wealthy settlers' hunting grounds. And so they were protected so they could remain a hunting ground for particularly, noble or higher income settlers. And it was on this idea that people ruin nature. We have to keep people out to keep nature pristine and untouched. And of course, we know this isn't true. People have been coexisting and living with, not outside of nature, living as part of nature in so many different kind of cultures, mythologies across the world. And even when I trace back, my European ancestry, going back, pre-Christianity, or even in kind of some of the early Christianity, like that still idea of like living with nature was still part of many of our belief systems around the world, but it's been lost. And we've talked about offsetting on this webinar as well, and the local move to slide over a wetland, as it was kind of so casually suggested. But as nations and as corporations try and meet net zero, and as they try and kind of balance their offsetting and meet biodiversity protection targets, there's a new wave across the world, and particularly in the global south, of these nations and these corporations buying up large tracts of land to have managed under their control, under kind of settler or colonial mechanisms. And we know from previous slides and from this conversation that's just not as effective. So as recent as 2014, for example, the Nature Conservancy, giant environmental not-profit environmental organization that does some good work, was earning income off an oil field located within one of their conservation reserves in Texas. So this duality of kind of money and nature, I think we've explored a lot of different kind of perspectives on that, are instances of it. But as we kind of like head out or begin closing out the webinar, I think it's important to think about who the players we've talked about are, and really think about the power of this situation, because Jim, myself, Dawn, any of us as individuals on this call just frankly aren't able to make the differences we need. And we're going to beat ourselves up trying. We're going to feel disappointed, and we're not going to feel like we've made the impact we want. But when we begin to come together as community, when, as Nancy taught us, we begin to build movements, we begin to watch conservation authorities where these decisions are being made, we've already had some very, very impressive wins, and we're just getting started. But we've had these wins in the face of a provincial government, a massive player in this climate and conservation conversation, being frankly the enemy, being someone who we're working against. So with this in mind, we know that the province is not just hiding from the climate emergency, but they are actively making it worse. And so, while it's unlikely any of us on this call can change Doug Ford's mind, many of us on this call working together do have a track record of changing Tom Jackson's mind, of trying very hard to change Lloyd Ferguson's mind. And we need our local conservation authority boards and our city council to be taking some of these monumental decisions they have been, such as stopping sprawl or not allowing an offsetting policy in the conservation authority, and taking that momentum and really running with it. So we're not just missing climate champions, though. Unfortunately, we do have climate deniers at the table. Whether old-fashioned climate deniers is less in fashion, less in the day. It's hard to say, oh, I don't believe in climate change. But it's very easy to say, I absolutely believe in climate change. Of course it's happening. but we need to build this warehouse so we don't pave over farmland somewhere else, which is what we heard from Lloyd. And as Seth Klein would say, that's the new type of climate denial. We also know that conservation for conservation's sake isn't enough. There needs to be meaningful relationship building, both with our land and water, but with the Indigenous stewards and caretakers who have cared for this land. And that includes sovereignty, governance, and in many cases, land back. And there is conflict between kind of conservation movements and the land back movement. And at 350, we've been trying to merge those and see that kind of the intersections where we can help each other and lift each other up. So yeah, with that, I will try again to see if we have former HCA Chair Brian Mccaddy on the line, and if not, we'll open it up to discussions. Dawn?
I'm in touch with Brian, and he was on, and I understand that he's coming back on. So we will have a chance to talk with him.
There he is. He's back on.
I think
He's on now.
I'm told he's on now. I'm not seeing on my list, but Brian, are you there?
Yeah, Don, I am back now. Thank you. Yep.
Okay, so Brian Mccaddy is a former city councillor from 2003 to 2018. He was the chair of the Conservation Authority from 2011 to 2014. In his earlier pre-council activity, he was the initiator and coordinator for the first biological inventory of the Hamilton area that was conducted through the Hamilton Naturalist Club starting in 1991, and is now, I think, been done 3 times, and which is what identified many of the areas that we now consider environmentally significant, a much greater number than there were when this work began that Brian initiated. You may remember that there was an attempt made by Enbridge to build a pipeline through the Beverly Swamp, a frack gas pipeline. Brian Mccaddy was one of the people who wrote to the Conservation Authority urging them to oppose this. And the Conservation Authority did take some steps to restrain the Enbridge, and it was probably one of the reasons why Enbridge eventually backed out of that pipeline. We hope they're not coming back, but we're ready for them if they do. And we've had Brian on before as on the Conservation Matters webinar. And I wanted to ask Brian, we saw some things this evening about the purposes of the conservation authorities and the suggestion that offsetting policy, relocation of wetlands, and so on should be adopted because it will increase the likelihood of jobs and taxes. Is that something that you recall from the Conservation Authority?
No, I think it's Don, or I should say Dr. McLean. It's important for the chair of the Conservation Authority to deeply represent conservation interests. And you know, when you're wearing that hat, you're carrying out that role. You've got a huge responsibility to look after the watershed that the Hamilton Conservation Authority looks after, the Spencer Creek watershed, and all the lands and waters that are part of that area. And what I reflected on when I was chair, I mean, to me it's a great honor to be the chair of the Conservation Authority. You think back to where the Conservation Authority in Hamilton started with Ben Vanderbrug as first general manager, John Coates, Scott Conkle, Bruce Duncan, Chris Firth Egland. It goes on, just sort of a who's who of conservation leaders in our city. And that is the job of the Conservation Authority chair, is to honor that history and that ethic and the culture that's established around the Hamilton Conservation Authority. And, you know, Hamilton Conservation Authority staff look to the chair for leadership. They, as they go through their daily work, and they work very hard, as you know, and I'll just put Scott Peck, the planner, on the spot in terms of mentioning his name and the work that he did on the wetland offsetting staff report, recommending against it, the hard work that he did. So every time they do that kind of work, they think about the Conservation Authority board, and they look to the board for leadership. So that's what's critical, Don.
Thanks, Brian. And we had a question that came up in the conversation here tonight about Indigenous voices at the Conservation Authority. And I think you were involved in some of the arrangements that were set up with the Haudenosaunee for an annual harvest. Can you fill us in a little bit on that?
Yes, that's right, Don. And just from an ecological perspective, you know that grazing deer in the Dundas Valley and the Carolinian Forest, they've become hyper abundant as a result of us and the way we've modified the forest and all the gardens and plants that we provide to them. So it's one of those difficult situations where in order to ensure other animals and plants flourish in the Dundas Valley, the decision was made to have a deer cull. And then the question, of course, is how do you do that? And these lands are the original lands of the Haudenosaunee that I think Jim perhaps touched on, and we made contact with Six Nations and the Haudenosaunee people, the Iroquois Confederacy, and the traditional chiefs that are there representing the Six Nations, and talked to them about carrying out the call, and it was important for them, and they have great respect, as you know, for deer as one species amongst many species, and they agreed to work with us, and in fact, I think I saw Jim speaking about wampum. They actually presented the Conservation Authority with a wampum to solidify that relationship between the Conservation Authority and the Haudenosaunee Iroquois Confederacy. So that's the direction we went in, and a direction that needs to continue. This idea of co-management of the lands is something that we all need to work from. I was not here earlier because I was on a call with my Parks Canada job up here in Tobermory with the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, and we're co-developing a management plan so we can manage the national parks collaboratively. So we were celebrating with the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation communities, the people in the communities, the progress that we're making towards doing that. So that's exactly what needs to happen in the days and weeks ahead.
Thanks very much, Brian. Thanks for coming on at short notice and adding this information, historical information. It's, I think, really helpful to our viewers, and certainly information that isn't easily available. At this point in time, I don't think there are any formal arrangements at the Hamilton Conservation Authority to engage Indigenous voices in decision-making. That was one of the things that got raised by some people during the offsetting discussion. I don't think, and it was mentioned that wasn't taken up, but that might be another way in which we might start to recognize who we are here, whose land we sit on, and the enormous role that our Indigenous brothers and sisters have done over thousands of years to maintain and enhance the lands that we are now sitting on.
That's certainly the case, and I'd love to maybe have the Indigenous liaison officer from Bruce Peninsula, Fathom 5 National Park, talk about how to make that happen, how you actually make that happen between the nation-to-nation relationship. It's absolutely imperative. There's just no value in continuing to manage, or to steward, a better word, steward these lands without the full involvement of the First Nations.
That's somebody we could look forward to inviting onto a future webinar as we try to do more work in this direction. I know we have some Indigenous friends locally who we're expecting to bring on to the webinar in the next couple of months. So that might be something we can work with you on, Brian. Thanks again for being here and being part of the Conservation Matters webinar. And I'll turn it back to you, Alex.
Yeah, and this is just a quick quick round of thank yous to the 350 members who helped out, Stop Sprawl, Action 13 for kind of helping as well, and for all of our guests like Brian Mccaddy on this webinar and past ones. But most of all, for our 40 plus people who consistently are coming out, we always get between 40 and 80 folks on these. And it's a real testament to the fact that I think we're all committed to learning about how our watershed, how these kind of trails and the nature around us are managed and stewarded, but also what we can do. And we have hopefully through this webinar shown that there's hope that when we come together, we can rack up some big wins. In fact, the offsetting policy, I think at the 350 table, we're really proud of, but the 18,000 people plus that raised their voice on stopping sprawl in Hamilton, there's something growing in our city. And we are really, really excited that all of you are a part of that movement as well. But with this information in front of us, we have some tough conversations ahead. We know who is and who isn't making the decisions they need to make. And we know that the climate crisis puts so much urgency on making it the right decisions and quickly. So with that, we'd love to open it up to some questions and a bit of discussion. And around 8:30, we'll try and kind of call it for folks who need to leave, but some of us on the webinar will stay on so the discussion can continue. So I believe Steph or maybe Dawn has been collecting some of those questions that we've heard from folks.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. We haven't had a huge amount of questions tonight, I think, because everybody has covered what they're saying so well. So there wasn't a lot of things left unanswered. Stan had a couple of questions, but had to leave not too long ago. So I will ask one on his behalf. And Anne had one as well. I haven't heard back from her about whether she wants to ask it, but both of these ones lead into or coincide very well with what Brian is just saying. So Brian, you might be able to speak to them best, but one of the questions we had was, have any Indigenous leaders ever served on CA boards? Or are there any now? And is that kind of what you mean when you talk about co-managing within conservation authorities, or they're separate nation representing their nation within the conservation authority? Sorry, that was kind of a many-tiered question.
Yeah, if you're asking me, I'm not aware of any First Nations or Indigenous person who has sat on the Conservation Authority board. In my memory, it could have been someone at some point. But I think beyond just a member on the board, it involves looking at the lands itself and perhaps establishing a formal memorandum of understanding or something along those lines that specifies how those lands will be managed jointly, and perhaps not just the Haudenosaunee but the Mississaugas as well. And there would have to be discussion as to which First Nations would need and want to be involved. But to me, it's something that is working so well up in the Saugeen Peninsula with the parks up there on the traditional territories of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. And it takes a lot of time to work through. We started the management plan up there about 2.5 years ago, and we're still working on the vision and the key elements, the very first part of it. But the relationship building that occurs around that table is absolutely worth the time. So I'd love to see the Conservation Authority engage in that.
Great, thank you so much. I think, Dawn, if you want to extend on that, go right ahead.
I just wanted to throw in a question to Brian. You sat on City Council and you were on the board of the Conservation Authority as chair. Can you recall exactly how we end up choosing people to sit on the board? I know there's several councillors and several citizens, I think 5 of each from Hamilton and then 1 from Puslynch. So how does Hamilton go about choosing these people? And would that give an opportunity that they might want to reach out to Indigenous nations to see if they wanted to be appointed?
Oh, you're muted, Brian.
I just lost the screen there for a moment. Sorry. Just before answering that, I want to identify former Councillor Dave Braden is on the call tonight too. So great to see Dave, and of course he contributed hugely to Hamilton City Council, a very difficult job. Yeah, the way the councillors are chosen are just within the council itself. The Hamilton City Councillors kind of get together and decide, put their names forward and decide who would be on the various committees that Hamilton City Council has, including the Conservation Authority. So it's really a bit of an old boys club decision, quite frankly. And then as to who would be vice chair or chair and that sort of thing, there's that's a bit of a discussion as well. And the citizen members of the committee are the councillors play a role in helping to choose them as well. So it's a bit of a funny arrangement, quite frankly, not that democratic, but that's generally what happens.
Thanks, Brian. Steph,
It's
you may
Wayne,
have
Wayne
others?
Cherry. I can elaborate on that. You need to apply through the city to be on the board as a citizen member, and then you are given an interview if they choose, and then they select that way. So not everybody gets an interview, etc. But it's through an application process, and then I think it's screened through a committee. So the first step is to apply. Thank you.
Thanks, Wayne.
Yes,
Steph?
thanks very much for elaborating on that, Wayne. Dawn, you stole Anne's question. No, I'm just joking. You worded it almost exactly as she was going to. So I think I may have one other question. I'm not sure, Alex, if you covered this during the webinar already, so I apologize if you had. But Stan also asked, can the feds overrule Ford's actions like on CAs? And can this eventually become a Supreme Court concern? Like, are there actions above what we're doing now that can be taken outside of the provincial government? Or because this is a provincial issue, like if I understand correctly, CAs don't exist in other provinces, can we go above the provincial government in this case?
Yeah, I can give it probably won't be a very satisfying answer, but it'll be a quick one. Governments can largely do with the limits of the Constitution whatever they feel so pleased to do. And so, well, we frequently hear about jurisdiction and, oh, I couldn't give clean water to First Nations. That's the province's job. Oh no, that's the federal government's job. We hear this ping pong back and forth on so many issues. We hear it with the highways between, will the feds step in and do an environmental assessment? At the end of the day, it's Doug Ford in Ontario, it's John Horgan in BC, it's Justin Trudeau across Canada that's sending in the RCMP and the OPP into these kind of things. Like, it's, there's people in positions of power have a lot of it, and it's their favorite pastime to pretend they have none. But I think if there's anything to be learned from Doug Ford, it's that you can do whatever you want if you're strong-willed enough to a large extent. It's just whether or not people will stop you. And so while that's maybe not the most satisfying answer, I really want to emphasize that it's whether or not people will stop you. And so that's where we as a group really have been trying to put our energy, is because we know we have power as a community, but we may not be able to convince Justin Trudeau of anything. We are able to have an impact locally, and that's what we've been focusing on.
Thanks very much, Alex. I appreciate it. Sounds like Anne has picked up on that and would like to ask something or add something now. So Anne, you go right ahead.
Yeah, well, okay, thanks, Alex. I'm not going to talk about that. I want to go back to this Indigenous and representation. I think that somebody said that you can offer your name to be considered by the councillors to be appointed to as a conservation authority rep. Would there be any way that the environmental groups could identify somebody that they thought would be good for that position and then somehow lobby for that position, for that person to be considered? Because sometimes people don't like submitting their own names. Similarly, it would occur for when we're looking at the Ford government to look for a candidate in our area that we could support that would that would be the most suitable candidate from a conservation perspective. So I don't know whether that's something that these groups could do. My other part of that question was, which was covered well before I got on here, within these environmental groups themselves, are there people in the planning organizations that are Indigenous? Is there anybody in Action 13 who is Indigenous? Environment Hamilton Indigenous, Hamilton 350. So there's two areas where I'm thinking about how can we include these people who have so much to offer and have given so much.
Those are some great questions, Dan. As I said to you earlier, and I might be incorrect, I'm not aware of any Indigenous members in Hamilton 350. I can't speak for Action 13, so Alex, if you want to pick up on that, you're welcome to.
Sure. Rather than going group by group, I was going to say, Dawn, why don't you maybe kind of round out some of the points there in the answer?
I think these are issues that need to be worked out with Indigenous nations. So we may like to have, because we want to be inclusive and pat ourselves on the back, have Indigenous representatives everywhere. That may not be the desire of our Indigenous friends, and it may not be a possible arrangement for them. The Mississaugas of the Credit, for example, have about 250 members in their entire First Nation group. So they get pressed repeatedly because they are the original mainland holders in this area and the ones who have water rights in particular. And it's a big task for them to find a way to be part of all the decision making in terms of sitting on boards, most of who's to do with very little to do with their specific concerns and interests. So I think you have to be a little cautious in terms of how we do that. But certainly, if you look at the composition of the Hamilton Conservation Authority Board as such, it's not a diverse board. It's not diverse in terms of Indigenous representatives. It's not diverse in terms of Black or other colored people being part of the board. And I think that's something that the Hamilton Council has been challenged on before with respect to the Police Services Board. So there's certainly opportunities for the City Council to approach this in a different way. Alex.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not going to jump in on that point, but I am just going to say we do try and respect your time on these webinars. And we appreciate the folks who have joined us. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you a polite out if you've needed to go and have been pretending not to or whatever. We're going to keep the conversation going. But for those of you who need to leave or can't stay, I just want to let you know that it's okay. We appreciate that you've joined us, and we want to make sure that we try and offer this in 60 to 90 minutes each month, so you'll keep coming back. That said, we'll keep it going. And yeah, I'll throw it back to you, Steph, or Dawn, for kind of more conversation. And if folks want to jump in, even if you don't have a question, have a comment, feel free to use the raise chat function. Now that we're not going anymore, yeah, I won't say chaos, just like unmute and speak, but you know, wave maybe to try and get on there.
I see Paul's hand up there, so maybe we can get Paul in.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Hi, I've heard it, I've seen it written and heard it discussed that if the provinces and or a province and the federal government really do want to get into a public fight and lock horns, what it's going to come down to is the riverbed is federal and the water is provincial. And that's where they finally have to make a deal. Alex and Brian, do you recall coming across that being said?
Sorry, I missed that a little bit, but I'll let Brian.
I wonder if you could repeat that a bit, Paul. I'm not sure what you were saying. Sorry.
Yeah, I've heard it said and written as things come up that if a province and the federal government really want to lock horns on something, say with the Grand River or the Credit River, if they just will not let up and make a deal, what it comes down to is the water is provincial and the riverbed is federal, and they have to make a deal.
So
Yeah,
a
so
bit
I'm not-
about the jurisdiction there. Question, Brian. I can't answer that, but maybe you can.
Yeah, generally the lake beds and the river beds are provincial crown land. They're not, the federal government doesn't have ownership. I'm thinking up here in Tobermory, Fathom 5 National Marine Park, the lake bed and the lake waters are provincial jurisdiction. There's an outstanding land and water litigation by the Saugeen and Ojibwe Nation for the lands and the waters up here. So that's working its way through the process. But right now, the waters are owned by the province of Ontario. So I don't think the federal government gets involved in a water body like the Grand River is the example, Paul, I think you mentioned.
Yeah, I'm told that opinion would say that we're talking about navigable water bodies, and if it's navigable, it's federal, except for the water, which is a bit silly, but that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, there's the Navigable Waters Act. So you're quite right. Those waters have to be navigable. So anyone can, Grand River, anybody can run their kayak or canoe down there. That's something we all have a right to do. But in terms of ownership, if there was some precious metal found in the base of the river, in the riverbed, then that would be administered by the province. So it's you're quite right. Transport Canada is the one that administers the Navigable Waters Act. So that's federal in terms of the right to traverse water bodies, lakes, rivers, but the actual ownership of the lake bed, the riverbed is provincial.
Okay,